Welcome to SIMcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine. The last few years, we've seen quite a few changes in how we teach both our trainees and our patients, largely owing to a trend towards teleradiology. Imaging informatics solutions have been crucial to maintaining connections with our patients and trainees, even though radiologists may not physically be present in the reading room. On this episode, hosts Mohanad, Prasad, Jason, and Ali speak with informatics and education experts Dr. Nabile Safdar and Dr. Omer Awan about the importance of informatics solutions for patient and trainee education. This is a special recap episode of our guest session at SIIM 2022, covering the role of virtual readouts, leveraging imaging informatics tools for effective trainee interactions, maximizing patient education, and discussing new opportunities for radiologist interactions with our patients. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of SIMcast.
Hey, Dr. Awan, Dr. Safdar, thank you so much for being with us here today. Now, let's start this conversation with, if you want to just brief everybody from our listeners who maybe didn't make it to SIIM 22, about the sessions you did at SIIM 22. So Dr. Awan, you had the informatics for trainee education, and Dr. Safdar, you had informatics for patient education. Dr. Awan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So this was a session that we did about remote education or remote learning and how that ties into informatics. And it was actually a three-part speaker session where I spoke on, trainee education. We had a resident, Kate Pilson, who spoke on, RAD Discord and how that was a new educational innovation because of the pandemic. And then we had Dr. Safdar, who spoke about informatics and particularly how it applies to patients and patient education. So my talk was really about what the pandemic has done to trainee education, the benefits, the pros, the cons of remote training, virtual readouts, and things related to, residents in education.
Yeah, thank you, Omer, and thank you for having invited me to the session in the first place, Dr. Awan. Mohanad, Jason, when we had this session planned, we wanted to make sure we touched all of our different constituencies when it came to communication. And so I focused on communicating with patients and a little bit with colleagues as well. And when it comes to communicating with patients in healthcare, we always haven't done a great job. If you look back to, the dawn of the internet and when people were first starting to use the internet, there were a lot of patient-centric resources that we in healthcare or in imaging and certainly in radiology put out there. But oftentimes they were difficult to follow. They were obscure. They used a lot of kind of technical knowledge. And we're now in the stage where with the Cures Act, we're in the age of patient portals, FHIR apps, and federal regulation in the United States that requires we make 8 categories of information readily available to patients so that they can receive them through portals or apps on their phones. But that is a challenge for many practices, for many systems. But it's also a great opportunity for improvement in future directions. And that was a little bit of what I talked about in my session.
Well, thanks for that recap. I wish I had been in attendance. It's one of those things where there's always so many great talks at SIIM. But I was told that the discussion included a merit of the pros and cons of teleradiology with virtual resident readouts. And I wanted to ask about kind of where the consensus is lying regarding the role of virtual readouts. Are they here to stay? Or is this their desire to bring, mostly in-person readouts back?
Well, I think that's a great question, Jason. There are many pros and cons to, teleradiology and virtual readouts and radiology residency programs. And, the pandemic really changed the way we teach, the way we educate, the way we interact with trainees, whether we like it or not. And, the benefits would obviously include the widespread dissemination of knowledge to trainees. Now we have a situation where, I can give a lecture and regardless of whether or not a trainee is in the same hospital as me, let alone the same country as me, they can have access to the lecture, right? We're now able to broadcast lectures to different, low resource, low income countries that can benefit from this. We've had programs like the APDR Health for the World have been able to really disseminate a wide range of knowledge to help and benefit, attendings, trainees, everyone. There have been more opportunities for residents. So now, for example, normally before the pandemic, you'd have a resident that was reading out in musculoskeletal radiology and they'd be focused on musculoskeletal radiology. Now there's an opportunity for a resident that's in musculoskeletal radiology to even hear a readout that's happening in thoracic radiology during that same day because of these, virtual, Zoom links that are available. So, there are tremendous amounts of opportunities and benefits to, virtual readouts, but, that doesn't come without a cost, right? And I think the main issue with virtual readouts and teleradiology is the lack of person or in-person communication, those visual cues, that mentorship that exists from reading out with your attending. If I'm reading out with Dr. Safdar, he may teach me something or give me a story about a case that really will resonate with me if I'm with him in person, or by the way he emphasizes it with his tone, or by the way he makes a subtle joke. That is much harder to do, in teleradiology. So I think, there are pros and cons. Are they here to stay? I think it is. The pandemic has really changed the way we view, education. And I think in-person education is superior to virtual education, but there is a room for virtual education. I think that there's room for, people for benefits of attendings. If they want to have a day where they can spend time with their family, why not? Why can't they read out virtually their residents, right? It's a great opportunity to add flexibility, wellness in different institutions and departments. In terms of the consensus, I think it's funny and it's interesting because we did a survey, an internal survey at University of Maryland where we polled all the residents and all the faculties about their perceptions about the virtual readouts. Are they beneficial? Is this something that we want to do moving forward? And, the vast majority of both attendings and residents wanted in-person readouts. They felt that in-person readouts were more beneficial to education and the educational mission of our department. So I think the consensus is, generally speaking, there is an impetus to bring back in-person readouts fully. But with that said, I still think virtual readouts are here to stay. It's just a matter of us adopting them and using them to the best possible way we can to further education.
Thank you. And so I think part of this question involves, we did answer this a little bit about virtual educational conferences, but what do you think about that specifically? Is there a lasting role for those virtual educational conferences? You mentioned global health, and I think that's a really powerful place to a use case that we've seen. And then what are some of the things we miss out on, though, by having virtual educational conferences?
So I think virtual educational conferences is a must. I think that there definitely is a role, and there's a major beneficial role for virtual educational conferences because it allows for really the widespread dissemination of knowledge across, continents, across, cities. It really makes the globe a lot smaller, right? It flattens the globe. So definitely there's a role for that. And, even if you take a look at, conferences like RSNA, SIIM, I mean, look how many people that were just tuning in virtually, right? So, it allows people to attend a conference that they may not have wanted to attend beforehand, right? So, maybe because of their time constraints or their responsibilities to their family, they couldn't do the travel to Orlando, but now they're able to do it from the comfort of their homes. And I think that this allows more participation in conferences going forward and due to people's flexibilities, their work schedule and their family schedule. So definitely there's a huge role for it and a needed role. And this should definitely continue, I think, kind of going forward. And I think we'll see this continue with many of the societies adopting this as like a dual, virtual and in-person platform. Now, are there drawbacks? Of course there is, right? So, if you're sitting at home, I would never have met you, Ali, if I sat at home, right? For SIIM, like I would never have got the opportunity to talk to you, drink a cup of coffee with you, gotten to know all the great things that you're doing, all your passions, your ambitions. That wouldn't have happened if I was sitting at home, tuning into SIIM. So the beauty of in-person conferences really is the networking, the ability to interact with other people, the ability to form lasting communications with other people because of the conferences, right? It opens up a whole new door of opportunities. I texted you this morning, right? I'll be saying, is this podcast still going to happen today? I wouldn't even have your number if I didn't come to the SIIM conference. So, it just opens up such a wide spectrum of opportunities by coming to conferences.
As we start moving towards more virtual settings for education, I wonder if either of you have any comments on the role that social media I know that Dr. Awan, you have a YouTube channel, and you mentioned the RAD Discord server and what roles these particular, mediums play and the usefulness around them. Because there's always a flavor of the month of, this is the new tool that we want to jump on. But how effective are they when we start disconnecting the person-to-person connectivity?
I'm happy to answer this. I don't want to steal Dr. Safdar's thunder. I know he has a ton of knowledge to tell us all, and I learned from him as well. But I'll just say this. I'll say that, it's about adapting to the needs of your trainees and the needs of learners, right? So this is what they want. If you were to poll a lot of the medical students today, if you were to poll a lot of the residents, they want these resources. They want these ability to these asynchronous learning tools like YouTube videos, social media. This is what they interact with. A lot of people, the whole landscape of education has changed even in the last 10 years. I was a resident not too long ago. I graduated in 2013. That's less than 10 years ago. I never used YouTube for anything. When I was a radiology resident, I never got on Twitter or Instagram. I didn't even have an account at that time. I know it was out then, but I had no account, right? And now I'm very active, obviously, on social media. So the whole landscape of the way we learn, the resources that we use has completely changed just in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's up to us as educators to adapt to those changes and to give and provide our learners with the things that they need so that they can be successful. One of the ways is YouTube channels. That's why I have, the MedED page, which is my YouTube channel, where I post regular videos on, MSK cases, tips on the residency match, USMLE tutorials. I try to be very broad, public health videos, just ways that I can disseminate information, because I know people will look to these resources and people will use these resources in a way that's beneficial. That'll help them. And, just speaking about the globe, I have people from India, from from Nigeria, all over the globe that are telling me that they like some of these resources. And as flattering as that is, this is just the new generation, the new mode of the way education is being taught, right? So I think there definitely is a need, and also just a need to embrace these new tools to educate the new generation of learners.
Yeah, I don't think I can add much or say it any better than you already have. I think as a general principle, we have to meet people where they are. And people are not in libraries looking at physical textbooks. People are on social media. They are on Discord. They're working remotely. Even in the same department, there may be, 10 to 20 locations that residents and attendings are spread out on as there's increasing consolidation in healthcare. It's not possible for people to be physically co-located all the time. And so when we say we're going to meet people where they are, we're not only talking about the content, but also the modality, right? So, you're going to train a med student different than a first-year radiology resident, different than a cardiology fellow, different than something to another attending. And as, we change as a society, we're going to become increasingly comfortable, and we already are, with remote work, with remote collaboration, and using all of the available channels of delivering that information appropriately, right? Whether it's social media or Discord or whatever it may be. So it's really about meeting people where they are. It is about the needs of the teacher and the instructor, but it's just as much about the needs of the audience and the learners.
It's great that we're able to meet the people where they're at, where the residents or trainees are at, and get them all sorts of educational material. But I kind of have to wonder, depending on where they are in their training, because being at a training institution, the way I would sign out with a fellow or senior resident is very different than I would with the first years that are just starting out right now. So what can you guys tell us a little bit about how doing virtual sign out affects those different facets of where the trainee is at, and how easy or difficult it is to do certain things as part of the sign out, given lack of experience and more experience?
I think it's definitely very challenging because, you have senior residents and fellows that display a lot more autonomy in the way they want to learn, the way they want to read out. We give them a lot more freedom to take ownership of cases. So I think in a lot of ways, it's easier to do virtual education for those that are a little bit more seasoned, like fellows and fourth year residents. Whereas, first years, they barely know how to make a report right now, right? It's just their first month of radiology. They're just learning the new vernacular in terms of the language, how to structure a report, these type of things. So for them, I think it is a little bit more critical for us to have more in-person learning and in-person readouts so that they can learn the ropes, the fundamentals of radiology so that they can then go on and be a little bit more independent, later. So I think it is challenging because the levels are different, but that's not to say, I have done virtual readouts for first year residents and they work just fine. But I think in a ideal environment, we would really want, first and second years to be a little bit more in person, and then, maybe have a graded experience where, senior residents and fellows all get a little bit more autonomy and independence to do some of the things that they want to do.
Yeah, Omer, I agree 100%. And Prasad, your question resonates with me. I think there are different workflows depending on the level of experience. For a junior trainee, it's helpful sometimes literally to point at the screen and be co-located and say, see that thing, and you're in the same space and you're able to work together. Now, I know you can do that virtually as well, but you can also gauge their attention, their emotion, their reaction much better when you're in person and cater your additional depth of teaching to what you're seeing in person in terms of their human responses. With a more senior person, my workflow is entirely different. In many cases, if I'm dealing with an experienced resident or a fellow, I have access to their pre-drafted, pre-dictated reports. And there have been cases, if someone I've been working with for years and I know them well, I'll say, look, if I agree with your report, I'm going to sign it and we're going to move on. And we're going to spend extra time on the small percentage of cases where I didn't agree or I think there's additional teaching value, rather than waste your time and my time with all the things that we have 100% concordance on. So it's a very different workflow. I don't read out every single case, the routines, the normals that agreed 100%. Our reading session is focused on, we'll do something and say, hey, I signed 80% of your cases, agreed 100%. I changed your spelling errors. Now let's focus on the 10, 25%, whatever it may be, where there's a lot of teaching value. So it is about their level, it's about the modalities, but the workflow changes in my experience. If you're going to really cater to their experience, frankly, an experienced fellow who's about to be an attending doesn't get as much value from watching you review the case in real time for the first time. It's much more efficient for them for you to have pre-reviewed it, and in some cases even approved their drafts or their prelims, depending on the workflow you use at your institution.
Something that came up during this conversation that pretty well here, I think, is the idea of this infrastructure that we need to support these virtual experiences. So Nabile, you mentioned the power of having the ability to share screens to show our junior residents what we're looking at and how we assess pathology. A degree of that may be lost when we go to virtual formats, right? Having that tactile experience, being able to have that mouse swap or that mouse share. And I'm wondering, I think we may have talked about this at the conference a little bit, but can we talk more about the necessary infrastructure to maintain as much as possible of that interaction? Some places like my institution, what we've done is we've incorporated a platform from a vendor that allows us to chat across the enterprise, and that lets us keep in touch with attendings, with co-residents, with technologists. Should PACS be also thinking about an interface where we can share screens and kind of maintain ways to look at the same thing on both sides? Sorry, I know that's a lot of questions. We can start with maybe one of those. So what's the basic infrastructure that we need for maintaining the most of our readouts?
Well, I think, the bottom line is you want to have, because there are virtual readouts, there has to be, a very solid internet connection, right? It has to be like excellent bandwidth. The technical issues have to be worked out, the VPN, et cetera, all these things to make sure everything is HIPAA compliant, which I think have already been worked out because, many people have been reading remotely even before the pandemic. I mean, like at University of Maryland, the faculty here tend to take call at home from their homes, from the comfort of their home. So it wasn't that much of an adjustment for us. With that said, you did mention, Ali, screen sharing and, sharing screens. I do want to address something that I think is very important that some institutions have not addressed appropriately. And that is when screen sharing, one should be able to screen share not only the current study, but also the prior study. The goal is you want to simulate the in-person reading experience as much as you possibly can. So often some people will do screen sharing and they'll only share the current study, but there's also a prior study, right? So in real time, you're looking at both studies together, but sometimes when you screen share, you're only seeing one study. And you really do want to simulate the actual experience that you see in real life, because oftentimes we refer to the prior study when we're comparing and we're making inferences and, findings and things like that. So That is very important. It's very important to be able to screen share both. The other thing that I think that's very important is encouraging questions, and encouraging questions. And I think trainees have to feel very comfortable asking questions. And that means reciprocating and being able to give a trainee opportunity to talk at the same time that you are, right? So, just like that would happen in real life. So those things I think need to be paid attention to. But, just the basic infrastructure of, the technical requirements of bandwidth, internet, security, VPN, all those things I think are relevant for the infrastructure to be successful for virtual readouts.
Yeah, and Omer, I agree 100%. And I'll add that it's not only diagnostic at the workstation readouts that are an opportunity. Increasingly, in procedural spaces, there are technologies that we just didn't have wide access to 10 years ago. For example, kind of more immersive cameras that allow a more immersive presence or virtual presence in a procedural room, right? I mean, we're talking about 3D cameras that allow someone to control where they're looking at or to have multiple views, not only at for example, in an interventional suite, the fluoroscopy that's being performed, but also the patient vitals, but also a video feed. Now, we're not going to pretend that that's going to give someone the true experience of inserting a needle into the groin or passing a catheter into the appropriate vessel. There's a tactile experience that I don't think could be replicated. But to get comfort with workflow, to be exposed to how the room works, to see a procedure virtually. I mean, it's amazing. It's just like you're almost there. You just can't lay your hands on the equipment or the patient. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to do more work when it comes to procedures, procedural training. And to Dr. Awan's earlier point, I mean, that's not just something that's valuable, potentially for global education efforts, but frankly, even for, I would have loved that the first time I walked into an OR or an IR suite. I didn't know what I was doing at all. I remember hitting my head on the lights, you know what I mean? Like contaminating the field, all kinds of missteps, which if I just knew how things worked by observing a virtual session, it would have been probably a lot better when I first walked into one of those rooms.
Thank you both for your thoughts. I would like to take the conversation in a bit of a different direction because I'm very curious about this. So Nabile, your session at SIIM was talking about, essentially patient engagement is how you get patients on this. There was this description of patient consultation or like a radiologist clinic. In your opinion, do you feel like practices are open to this idea? And if not, what are the reservations and what are things that we could do to address these? So of course, Nabile, I'd like to start with you and then we hear from Dr. Awan after.
Mohammed, great question. I think practices have been talking about this for a while, and there are a few practices that have really fully implemented embedded radiology clinics, where they're co-located with, for example, at Emory head and neck or ENT clinic, where they're able to see patients, consult with them, show them their scans, and really be a part of that patient empowerment process. We see this frequently in pediatric imaging and fetal imaging as well. We see this in breast imaging, all to various degrees. It's well received by patients. There's good evidence that patients like it. They enjoy it. They're more engaged. They're more compliant with their therapeutic program. Our referring partners or our other clinical partners really enjoy this as well. Our friends in cardiology, for example, do this, and that's something which is routine for them as well. So there's a lot of evidence that I think in a growing experience that patients want it, physicians want it, providers want it. It is really valuable, but it has not met widespread adoption. And I think the reason boils down to time and money. This is an expensive proposition. It is not an RVU generating activity. It's not part of the interpretive reimbursement process, right? When you talk about CPTs and RVUs, there's nowhere that this is counted. So I think the challenge for us, Mohammed, to take this to the next level is really an advocacy issue about how do we do what's best for our patients, what we know patients want, what we know improves outcomes, and make sure that there's an incentive for systems to support this.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And quite frankly, I don't have much to add, but I will say this, if you take a step back, ultimately, what are we doing? When we generate a report in radiology where, yes, we're helping our referring physician and helping them care for the patient, but we're serving our patients, right? That's what we're doing. And as physicians, that's exactly what we're doing. So, philosophically, this is a great idea, and this should definitely be met favorably by everyone, because this would just enhance patient care by allowing, a two-way street for communication to occur directly between physicians and patients. And, I can't tell you how many times, like my parents, friends come to me and ask me, what does this mean? What does this mean in the CT scan, right? So the way we talk and the verbiage that we use is not very clear to the patients that we're serving. And oftentimes it's the responsibility of the referring physician, like the internal medicine physician or, the surgeon, to talk to them about this. But even they don't completely understand our reports, right? I mean, they may understand the impression, but they may not understand some of the vocabulary that we use. So I think, philosophically, this is a great opportunity to sort of demystify some of those concepts and those words and verbiage to make things a lot more clear to patients. I think the drawbacks and the reservations have, been well articulated by Dr. Safdar already.
Sorry, I'll just interject super quick. I know Ali wants to ask a follow-up, but I'll just say that, as a patient, I've seen it. So every time I go for a scan, I make a point of getting a copy of my scans and my reports. And when I introduce people to the field of imaging informatics, I tell them the first thing you need to know is that these radiologist reports are written in like a very scientific language. So don't read into it too much. Like my personal report once said that my pancreas was unremarkable, which of course in scientific language means it's fine. But in, day-to-day street language, like, what do you mean it's unremarkable? I'm special and so is my pancreas. Ali, over to you.
No, Mohammed, you have a very special pancreas and liver and kidneys and gallbladder. You're very special.
But not a gallbladder. That one has been taken out.
No, that was bad. We had to get rid of that one. You're absolutely right. All right, Ali, go ahead.
You beat me too. I was going to say the same thing. I think Mohammed's pancreas is really special, but apparently Prasad likes more than just a pancreas. So that's okay too. So quick thought, Omer and Nabile. So I think we have so many more follow-ups here because it's just such an interesting topic. And I think there is a changing landscape here. One of those is there interest in full-time radiology jobs as patient consultants, or maybe even part-time? And I guess if you think there would be interest, what are some of the barriers?
Well, I think there's obviously an interest, that's debatable. Philosophically, I think there would be an interest because, again, you're providing patient care, but the problem is it going to generate revenue, right? I mean, at the end of the day, medicine is a business, right? So, the bottom line is this going to generate revenue? Is this going to generate RVUs? Is this going to take us away from doing procedures or reading, 20 or 30 MRIs that we need to do to generate the revenue we need to sustain our practice or to sustain the radiology department? And the answer to that is, well, no, it's not going to, right? Because you talking to a patient may take 30, 45 minutes and you haven't done anything in terms of building revenue, right? So that's the barrier, and that's the major barrier. And that would be the major reason why, this model wouldn't succeed. Because if you have to pay someone's salary to be a consultant when they're not generating the appropriate revenue, that's not going to be justified from a business perspective or a business model.
Yeah, Omer, I agree. And to follow up on that, Ali, I would say we would have to be very careful about making sure that is done in a way that doesn't harm patients also. It works well when there's a really close relationship between the patient and the providers that order the study and the radiologists, and they're all very tightly on the same page. But frankly, a radiologist who doesn't have the full picture, or the full clinical picture, the full context of that patient's story and their clinical story can, in some cases, without appropriate training, do harm in these cases, right? If they're talking about what's not in their purview, about next steps, about the next diagnostic steps, about therapeutic options, which they're not qualified to talk about. So I would say there is interest. I think there are people who would enjoy doing this. And I've also been to practices where even routinely this is done with outpatients. But it really, in my opinion, works well where there's a really tight coupling between a clinical service and the imaging service. And I'll tell you, cardiology does this really well, right? Because they may, some cases, be the clinical provider that's also performing the echo or the cath, and they can provide that consultative service either at the time of imaging or at the time of follow-up. So I think in a service like radiology, just to take the big picture, I do think there's interest. I think it's incredibly valuable, but it's not easy to do and not actually harm the patients as well. We've seen psychological harm from the immediate release of imaging narratives, which is now required in patient portals and apps. But we've also seen people say, hey, in this case, Mohammed, you joked that, hey, they called my pancreas unremarkable and I thought it won the beauty pageant of pancreases. But, in other cases, we've seen people express concern about, well, what does it mean that I have atelectasis or that there's no significant change in this lesion when I was expecting it to have gotten smaller? There's anxiety that's created in some cases. So I do think there's interest. I think it's the right thing to do, but it needs to be carefully done and appropriately done. And when it's integrated with a clinical service, which is, I think, a direction that is likely for us to pursue, it's a great opportunity. I think we can get it right.
Well, thank you very much for that. Continuing with this train of thought about how we communicate to patients and how we can empower them with knowledge, maybe we could talk about some guiding principles for when we communicate with them in a digital means. And there was an interesting episode that we had on SIMcast. It was episode number 40, and it was talking about the Porter project at Penn Medicine, where they're basically generating lay reports. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about creating lay reports that can be readable for patients and just about these guiding principles that we want to think about.
Yeah, Ali, I think the Porter project, Dr. O, Dr. Cook, Dr. Khan, and team at Penn is great. So people, if you're not familiar with Porter, in the Porter project, in my understanding, it allows patients that are reviewing a radiology report to review hyperlinks to definitions of, for example, what is the medial meniscus or what is a meniscal tear? So this jargon that we tend to use in radiology reports can be demystified a little bit. That is one of the exemplar project of how we can meet patients where they are if they need to look up what a medial meniscus is or what a meniscal tear is, to be able to click a link and get a definition in lay terms about what that means. I think this is the type of effort that we're going to have a lot of opportunity around to meet patients where they are, give them the type of information that they need in their terms. It's not going to only be about the information in our jargony, difficult to read radiology reports, but it's also going to be where patients are consuming these reports. For example, patients older than 65, probably about 30% of them don't have a smartphone. They have a cell phone, but not a smartphone. So how do we reach that population? How do we reach, as Dr. Awan mentioned earlier, for trainees, we worry about high-speed access, but the same thing for patients. What about high-speed internet access, not only for the increasingly common telemedicine reports, but to be able to download imaging in the future? So we've seen this in other industries. For example, you can go and get some very technical details about a new property that you're looking at purchasing or renting and get it broken down in a layperson's terms from a lot of websites. I think that's where we're going to be going in the future for imaging as well. And frankly, I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI, NLP methods to be that translator between the obscure, obtuse, jargony physicians who create these reports and guilty as charged to the patients who might be, our parents' friends, our cousins, uncles, siblings, or neighbors who, really want to consume this information and not just it be data, not just be information, but translate to knowledge and actionable information and actionable wisdom. And getting up that hierarchy, that pyramid from just data to wisdom, something you can make decisions with, is the challenge, is the informatics challenge. I think that's the hill we need to climb.
Thank you both for the great discussion as far as patient engagement. I do want to back up just a little bit back to trainee education. And I'm wondering if either of you see a role for AI in trainee or even patient education for that matter. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Awan?
So I think AI's role is going to be very promising in education and trainee education. I think that there's a huge role, and there's been a lot of discussion on, precision medicine and precision education, how we can individually tailor education to specific trainees. So for example, what that means is that, let's say somebody is on call or somebody is getting ready to take call. We can simulate that call experience by having, a trainee be given a set number of cases to read, based on how familiar they are and based on their ability to answer cases correctly, answer questions incorrectly. Additional cases can be provided for them automatically through artificial intelligence technology, where then they can be graded in terms of, the difficulty of the cases. And if a case like acute appendicitis is missed, then maybe other cases of acute appendicitis will come to that person's queue so that they can see different presentations, that they can eventually master that diagnosis. So this is sort of what the future, I think, of radiology will look like, and how we'll augment simulation to help train the next generation of learners. So this is just one way where, AI can really be used to individualize the strengths and weaknesses of a trainee in terms of education. So I think the applications are limitless. I mean, I'm providing one, basic example of how AI can really do this. There's so many ways, even in a workflow, in the way we learn, conferences, all this stuff can be applicable, in terms of AI. And I think we're just scratching the surface, and we're just starting to learn how AI can do this. So very promising, I think, for our field.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Omer. And I think also, as AI applications become much more common in our clinical workflow, we're going to start to raise questions that we just don't have great consensus industry-wide or practice-wide on. Some of these questions have been around for a while, and we can learn from our early experiences with, for example, breast computer aided detection and diagnosis. But the questions come up over and over again, right? Are we compelled to record every markup that an AI provides? Should we disclose that, for example, in the patient portal? What about when the outcome of AI is really meant for the stroke team and the neurologists want to take action immediately because they want to save brain, and time is brain, but the neuroradiologists are still in the process of giving their final review? I mean, these are real questions that departments and practices, radiologists, cardiologists, neurologists, et cetera, are struggling with today. And so as we go forward, this is going to be part of requisite resident education, because the trainees of today are the people that are going to be answering these questions tomorrow. What about incidental findings that are reported by AI in a clinical setting versus those that are discovered during the research and development process? What are our policies, our procedures for that? We're going to be, frankly, looking to our trainees to help us answer these questions, because they're going to be the decision makers in just a matter of a few years, where the old guys like myself are looking to the young folks to say, hey, what do you think about this? I don't understand this stuff nearly as well as you did because I didn't have it during my training. How do they do it at your program? So there's a lot of opportunity for trainees, for residents, for fellows to learn about this, to become the experts on this, and frankly, contribute actively to the conversations about the best ways to deal with these. And not only from a workflow perspective, but obviously there's a lot of health equity, concerns as well around AI, and that's all kind of open field for discussion.
Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, so you kind of touched on the next question a little bit. I'm interested to hear about what the challenges are in teaching the basics of AI to trainees. And we can go beyond the challenges of actually training and distilling that information to the trainees, but also, you touched on that a lot, Nabile, where what to do with the results of this data and so on. Omer, would you like to handle this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to happen. It's just a matter of time, right? I think, just like we train our first year residents, second year residents, on protocols and how to protocol a study, residents will need to learn how to evaluate certain AI algorithms. This will be part of their training, in 10 years, mark my word, this is going to happen, So this will happen. The challenges will be to understand what this is, to get faculty adequate training of this. Faculty have to understand this in order to teach us and train this, and just have the resources to do so, and finding the time to do this, because, it's a 4-year residency and they have to learn the interpretive skills of the fundamentals of diagnostic radiology and interventional radiology. This will need to be added on as well as another core competency where, trainees will need to gain some sort of understanding in order to evaluate certain AI algorithms, which algorithms to use, why is this a faulty algorithm for detecting a pulmonary nodule versus one that is more well-received, or something that, I can put in a report. So these are going to be the challenges that the future trainees are going to face when they're coming and starting to learn radiology.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Omer. And Jason, it's a great question. The challenges are going to be many. I think we're well poised with SIIM, for example, and other organizations, to provide the training for this. And it's not going to be one size fits all. There are going to be folks that really are interested in being informed end users, who are not doing harm by their use of a product that they've gotten that's FDA cleared, that's been set up already by their IT friends, that's paid for, and they're just using in the workflow. But they need to be informed users. And then there are folks who are going to want to be experts in these new technologies and AI. I mean, they're going to need to know the difference between a confusion matrix and the AUROC and the AUPRC, which I couldn't probably explain off the top of my head. And if you get me into F1 and precision, frankly, I'm going to be Googling it, you know what I mean, before I have an educated conversation. But I foresee that we're going to have, just like, 20, 30 years ago, if you had to explain that there's a radiologist or any physician who's a specialist in informatics, everybody would say, what is that? And now that's pretty routine or increasingly routine. And I think there's whether it's a subspecialty or another specialty, I think AI practitioners, there are going to be some people who really spend their careers on learning this well. And so creating those multi-track learning opportunities for the trainees that just want to be educated end users versus those that want to make this the focus of their career, that's going to be some of our challenge in differentiating those learning opportunities and not sending people down the wrong track, right? If you start trying to train an expert when someone really just wants to be an end user, that's a lost opportunity, and vice versa. If someone really wants to be an expert and we keep giving them the same basic lectures over and over again, that's a lost opportunity as well.
Thank you both for a very informative talk. Obviously, we always learn from you every time we talk to you or hear from you. Time is running out, so I wanted to give it to both of you for any closing thoughts, anything else you wanted to add, any resources you wanted to promote. Dr. Awan, you mentioned, for example, your YouTube channel. We'll be happy to put a link to that in the description, but feel free to mention anything you have. So we'll start with you, Dr. Awan, and we'll go to you, Dr. Safdar.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk and engage with all of you guys, Muhammad, Prasant, Jason, and Ali, and Nabile, of course, who has been one of my mentors and one of my bigger brothers always. So just very humble and grateful to do this. Yes, my YouTube channel is MedED page. Subscribe, like, share. You know the drill. Would love to pass on that free knowledge for everyone worldwide.
Yeah, likewise. I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity. And I will also plug Omer's social media presence, which is greater and more interesting than mine. But I'll also make a brief plug for the NICRAD, the National Imaging Informatics course. The next installation of that is scheduled for September 19th through 23rd. Remember, this is a course which is a week long. It's a virtual course. It's a collaboration between SIIM and the RSNA. And some of the best speakers ever in informatics and AI, in leadership and change management, all of those topics are well covered. It's geared towards fourth-year radiology residents, but others are welcome, and many are welcome to sign up for this. We welcome international learners as well. So check it out, search NICRAD on the SIIM website and sign up for it, or get your program director to sign you up for it, which is even better.
Excellent. Thank you both so much.
SIIMcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at SIIM_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.